Why go it alone? Crop West Insurance gives you expert support, better commissions, and in-depth educational retreats that set you up for success. They've spent 60 years perfecting the art of growing crop insurance agencies, and now it's your turn to join the movement. Crop West Insurance, where agents come to thrive. To find out more, please visit cropwestinsurance.com. Crop West Insurance Incorporated is an equal opportunity provider and employer. Hey there, and welcome to the Crop Insurance Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rydell, a third-generation crop insurance agent, and I'm here to help you navigate the ins and outs of crop insurance. It's what my family's been doing for generations, so you're in good hands. Our goal here is simple, to educate our listeners. Crop insurance can be complex and overwhelming, but I believe that understanding it is crucial for every farmer. So whether you're a seasoned farmer looking to stay updated or a newcomer seeking guidance, this podcast is for you. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Crop Insurance Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Rydell. And today we're diving into part 2 of our margin protection discussion. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, be sure you go back and check it out first. We covered the basics of margin protection, how it works, and some key terms that you're going to need to know for this episode. Today, we're going to be getting into how the harvest price option works and walking through some real-world examples of a payout calculation. Just follow along as you break it all down so that you can understand the overall concepts of how this program works. So what is the harvest price option? Well, the harvest price option is an add-on feature that can increase your coverage when the market prices go up. So here's how it works. Without the harvest price option, your coverage is locked in based on the projected price that's set before the planting season. With the harvest price option, if that harvest price is higher than the projected price, then your expected revenue increases to reflect that price jump. What's important here is that the harvest price option does not reduce your coverage. It only helps you if the price goes up instead of down. So when can you choose it, or when can you add that harvest price option? Well, you can elect it when you sign up for your margin protection policy on or before the sales closing deadline. So think of that harvest price option as a safety net for rising market prices. If the crop prices go up by harvest, your protection increases, but only if you opted in from the beginning. Okay, so how does the harvest price option impact your payouts? It's okay to understand the definition and the concept of how it works, so let's break it down in a real-world loss example so that you can get some numbers behind some of these definitions and help you understand this concept a little more. So let's look at this scenario. And for this scenario, we're going to have some assumptions here. Let's say that the projected price is $6 a bushel, the harvest price is $7 a bushel, the expected county yield is 50 bushels an acre, and the coverage level you're at is 90%. Now, when looking at the calculation for your expected revenue, you'll remember that your expected revenue equals your expected county yield times the projected price. So in this example, you're going to take 50 times $6, you're going to have $300 an acre. Since there's no harvest price option, the $6 projected price is locked in, even though the market price went up. So now let's look at that calculation if you had the harvest price option. Instead of staying at that $300 an acre, we're going to use the harvest price in our calculation. Again, the expected revenue formula is the same. It's the expected county yield, but now with the harvest price option, it adds that verbiage of the higher of the projected or harvest price. So you're going to take that expected county yield times the harvest price because it's higher than the projected price, so 50 times $7, and now you're sitting at $350 an acre for your expected revenue with the harvest price option. So one of the key takeaways here is that in this example, the harvest price option adds up to $50 an acre in coverage which can make a big difference in a loss scenario. Now, you do have to take into account the premium increase that comes with the harvest price option, so you'll want to quote it out to find out what your numbers add up to. So how does this all come into play when we calculate a payout? Well, let's assume that our actual yield came in a little lower than expected and our input costs increased a little bit. Well, step one is looking at our expected margin before harvest. So we're going to have our expected revenue with the harvest price option at $350 an acre, and our expected costs are at $250 an acre. The expected margin formula is simply expected revenue minus expected costs. Well, if you have the harvest price option, you're looking at $350 minus $250 for an expected margin of $100 per acre. Now, if you'll remember, if we didn't have the harvest price option and we had to use that projected price versus the harvest price for our expected revenue, that came in at $300. You're still using the same expected costs regardless of the harvest price option or not. So you're going to take $300 minus the $250. You're going to end up with an expected margin of $50 per acre. Once we know that expected margin, if you'll remember from part one of our series, we need to figure out our trigger margin because that is where we can determine if we have a loss or not. And again, your trigger margin is simply your expected margin minus your deductible. Now, the deductible, you're going to take your expected revenue times 1 minus your coverage level to come up with that deductible. So in our example where we have the harvest price option, our expected margin was $100, and our deductible is going to be our expected revenue of $350 and multiply that times 1 minus our coverage level of 90%, and you end up with a deductible of $35. So your trigger margin is going to be that $100 minus the $35 deductible, so you're going to be at a $65 trigger margin with the harvest price option. Now, if you did not take the harvest price option, you're going to have to use those lower numbers, which take the projected price into account and don't give you the benefit of that harvest price. So your expected margin was only $50 without the harvest price option, and your deductible is now going to be $300 times 1 minus your coverage level. So that's going to be a $30 deductible. So 50 minus 30 is a $20 trigger margin. So you can see how it pretty quickly changes your math, because if you had the harvest price option in this example, you'd have a $65 trigger margin, whereas without, you're sitting at $20. Now, the other thing to note here is that not only does your harvest price option change what your expected revenue is going to be, that translates to what your expected margin is going to be, on down to your trigger margin. Now, this is where it's going to vary between you and your neighbor. If you took the harvest price option and they didn't, you could see where you would have very different trigger margins. The other item to consider that we covered in part one of this series is your coverage level is going to change your deductible as well. The higher your coverage level, the lower your deductible. And the opposite of that is true as well. The lower your coverage level, the higher your deductible. So make sure you carry that math out when figuring out what your trigger margin is going to be, as that can impact your coverage dramatically. Now that we know what our trigger margin is, we can start to look how that compares to the actual margin and the actual numbers at the end of the policy period. So the next step is going to be determining our actual margin. In order to do so, we're going to have some assumptions. So the final area yield is 40 bushels per acre. And if you'll remember, the harvest price is now at $7 a bushel. So in order to determine the harvest revenue, you're going to take the actual area yield times the harvest price, or in this case, 40 times $7. So you're looking at a harvest revenue of $280 per acre. Now, the harvest costs, they increased a little bit. And if you'll remember on harvest costs, some of those are variable costs like fuel and fertilizer, and those can change. And some are fixed costs. And your county actuarials is where you're going to find that data. But in this case, let's just assume that the costs went up a little bit and we're looking at $260 an acre in harvest costs. So now your actual margin is going to be your harvest revenue minus harvest costs, or in this case, $280 per acre minus $260 per acre, which results in an actual margin of $20 per acre. Now, determining if you have a payout is fairly simple. You're going to compare your trigger margin to the actual margin. Now, if you'll remember, our trigger margin with the harvest price option was $65, but our trigger margin without the harvest price option was $20. And since our actual margin is $20 per acre, there would not be a loss, or there would be no indemnity if you did not carry the harvest price option in this example. But since the actual margin is lower than the trigger margin with the harvest price option, a payout is triggered. Once we've determined that a payout will be triggered, the final payout calculation formula is as follows. It's your trigger margin minus your actual margin, and then you're going to multiply that times your acre, your share, and your protection factor. So in this example, if you had 1,000 acres and 100% protection factor, we're going to be looking at a payout of about $45,000 because you're going to take the $65 per acre on your trigger margin minus the $20 per acre on your actual margin, which is $45. Then you're going to multiply that times 1,000 acres times your 100% share times your 100% protection factor. Again, that's going to give you that $45,000 payout. Now, if you took a higher protection factor, let's say the 120% factor, your loss would increase from $45,000 to $54,000. Now, obviously, if you took a lower protection factor of, say, 80%, your loss would decrease to $36,000. Keep in mind that depending on which way you choose on your protection factor, your premium will change as well. A key takeaway here is that with that harvest price option, your payout potential increases significantly. Without it, you'd have a lower expected revenue, meaning a smaller or no payout, and the protection factor you choose will also impact your payouts as well. How do your federal crop insurance policy payouts affect your margin protection payouts? Now, this is a very important note. If you also have an underlying federal crop insurance policy like your revenue protection or yield protection, any payout from that policy will be subtracted from your margin protection payout. This is how the rules are written, and you'll remember that if you have an underlying federal crop insurance policy, you receive a premium discount on your margin protection policy. And the big reason you receive that premium discount is that your potential loss could be affected by your underlying federal crop insurance policy. So a quick example, if your margin protection payout was going to be $45,000 and you already received an underlying revenue protection payout or a yield protection payout of $30,000 on that underlying federal crop insurance policy, your final margin protection payout would be that $45,000 margin protection loss minus the $30,000 underlying federal crop insurance policy loss. So you would end up with a $15,000 loss in that scenario. Now, if that underlying policy loss exceeds your margin protection loss, then you would just not receive a margin protection loss in that scenario. Some final thoughts on whether or not you should elect the harvest price option. Well, one thing to keep in mind is that harvest price option is good for farmers who want to protect against rising market prices. Now, it might not be necessary for farmers who don't expect major price jumps or simply looking at keeping their premiums lower, as the harvest price option does come with an added cost. However, If crop prices go up, that harvest price option ensures your coverage adjusts accordingly, meaning larger potential payouts in a given loss year. So you'll want to take that into account when making your decision. Well, that's a wrap on part 2 of our margin protection series. By now you should understand what the harvest price option is and how it works. Also, how that harvest price option can affect your expected revenue and payouts. You should also understand the concept of how your coverage level should affect your deductible and how that protection factor can increase or decrease your loss payout. How all of that translates into a real-world payout calculation and understanding how your underlying federal crop insurance policies interact with margin protection payouts. The final key piece of information to understand with margin protection is that it is an area risk plan. So you need to understand how those area risk plans work and what the risks associated with them are. If you still have questions, make sure you reach out to your crop insurance agent to see how this applies to your operation. Every crop and every region is different, so you need to run the numbers before making your decision. If you found this episode helpful, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your fellow farmers. Thanks for tuning in to the Crop Insurance Podcast, and we'll see you next time. From my family to yours, thank you for joining me today. Explore more at cropinsurancepodcast.com, where you'll find episodes, articles, and tools to help you make the most of your coverage. Be sure to subscribe and share with your friends and neighbors. Remember, this info is just a guide. For specific rules, please refer to the Crop Insurance Handbook and your appropriate crop provisions. This institution is an equal opportunity provider and employer.